Get on the board. Oh, there we go. We're going to get rolling. I forgot to bring the large-sized bottle of Excedrin for all of you that may have a headache by the time we're done. But you'll have to buckle up your seatbelts for this. I'm trying to balance both practical, but I also want to raise up Christian thought. I think we've allowed, in too many cases in the church, our thinking to get lazy. And I think the world has taken advantage of that and started to put out some things. I think in many cases there is good historic and biblical evidence for the contrary, but unfortunately we have to know it and we have to be able to do it. So my hope is by the end of this 4-week series, you'll be able to at least have a couple of key bullets in a discussion that allows you to at least articulate reasonable belief. I think this is not the beyond the shadow of a doubt like a criminal case, but I think it's more like a civil case. What does the preponderance of evidence say? And I've always taken that position in a dialogue or apologetic discussion. I can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt God exists. There's always going to be a step of faith. But I can demonstrate it's not unreasonable. It's not some wild fantasy. It's not some made-up story. There is good reasons to think that what we believe is true. And then for those of us who have experienced God firsthand, we see him in the ways he delivers. Before I jump in, I do want to give a bit of a disclaimer. And it's in your notes even, because I think it's important that we reflect on this. Apologetics is not to be about winning or losing. It's a framework for rational thought and discourse or dialogue. When I first learned debate back in high school, it was about winning and points and scores. But I think when we talk about the spiritual universe, it's about souls and lives. People that desperately need to know Jesus, that have listened to a world around them and have given them ideas that somehow Christianity is either insufficient or false. And I hope by the end of 4 weeks you can come with a real confidence that neither of those two statements are accurate. There is good reason when we look at this. I also want to say doubt is okay. I think sometimes in the church we've taken this position that, you just have to believe it and that's that. Well, yes, there is faith, no doubt, but it is okay to question. As even Colin painted yesterday, God can handle our emotions. There's nothing that we're going to encounter that surprises God. And I think critical thinking and questioning things is important. And doing the research for this series, it's very apparent to me there are some well-meaning Christians who have given consistently inaccurate statements, sources, dating. I found I had to triple check most resources because there was a pretty decent, probably in the range of 25% inaccuracy on mainline Christian websites. And so for me, I want us to have this healthy tension between skepticism and critical thinking and faith. And I think if we look at the significant philosophers through time, they've found that balance, and they found there's a place to say, I don't yet know this, and that's okay. Also, don't assume someone else's beliefs or positions. Ask them to clarify. Very often, we will find they fall into certain tracks or patterns. They've heard the latest YouTube video, and they're pseudo-scientifically educated. But get in and ask those Socratic questions, the how, what, where, why, when. And find out what they really think, if they have any substance, or was this some one line they saw in, a Twitter feed or Instagram that they now have assumed is actually true. Very critically, behave in a loving manner in all discussions of truth. This isn't meant to be a baseball bat. God didn't bring any of us in that way. He was loving and gentle. For some of us, he did have to beat around the head and shoulders more than once to kind of get the truth in. But he also gave us the time and the opportunity to process. And however many years you've been in this walk, being able to digest it and understand him more deeply and come to relationship with him. I also would suggest strongly it's best to set aside specific times for deep conversation. The quick, hey, let me talk to you may or may not be the place for deep theological conversation. I think it can be intentional. I think it's also part of healthy boundaries. A lot of people have felt like people are just trying to convert them or save them, or there's just this agenda. I think sometimes we need to step back from that and say, hey, it's okay for us to be friends, to do the things that friends do, and then also set aside time to have the real conversations around truth. And even allow them maybe to gauge the tempo of that. And finally, Christians don't get points for saving someone. I think there's almost this sense that somehow we are responsible for the saving work, and we're not. We are just his vessels, earthen vessels that hopefully live out this example of God's love for the world in a way that's fragrant and attractive. Yes, I think we need to have good arguments and defenses and sound thinking, but at the end of the day, God's going to call those who he calls. Each of us had our own story. Some of us resisted for a while in that calling. Some of you may have been fortunate and found God very young in life, and great. But the majority of the people we're encountering today are coming with little to no church backgrounds. We're in a postmodern, post-truth world, and so they don't even have the operating tenets, in some cases, the basic of the gospel story. Their definition of Christmas and Easter has been distorted by commercialism and really a lack of understanding. I think it's part of our job to bring this in. Hopefully you all got the notes. I didn't want you to get writer's cramp, so there's 5 pages of typed notes here. And then a little handout that you can use as we go through this series. And on the front is my arguments for Christianity. As you begin to build the ones that appeal to you and you think you can effectively represent, put them there. And also as we go through, there's the second page of your doubts or skepticism or questions you hear from skeptics. So as we get opportunities for Q&A, we'll start to handle those and talk about them in real world terms. So, big word to start off, epistemology. This is the theory of knowledge, especially with regards to its methods, validity, and scope. It's the investigation of what distinguishes a justified belief from opinion. By the way, this is a dictionary definition, so if you get atheists going, well, you have to prove God exists, tell them to go back to the dictionary of what knowledge or truth is. It's a justified belief, not a beyond any shadow of a doubt proof. There's a lot of things we could have never known in science, for instance, without being able to say, here's my hypothesis, here's my test, here's the most likely answer given those facts. And so I want you to ponder something. In a world that says there's no truth, are the labels on a bottle of medicine and a box of rat poison useful, and can we tell the difference? Because in the world's view and what they like to spout in the social circle is, well, there's no difference. It's just relative to your feeling and experience. I'm going to tell you what your experience will do. The box of rat poison will kill you. There is an absolute truth. It doesn't matter how you feel about it, what social context you want to put around it. That is poisonous. On the other hand, the bottle of medicine, if it's for something that's your ailment, will help and cure you. And so I think we have to get back to very basic realities in a lot of times these discussions, because sometimes the philosophical takes this very wild tangent and tries to say, I'm going to construct this paradigm around this set of beliefs or principles. Okay, but do they work in real life? Are those actually things you would use in your day-to-day experience, not just in trying to mock Christianity, which is what the majority of the YouTube and the secular social media does now. They create these straw man arguments or ludicrous assumptions. And we have to sometimes ground it back to, wait a minute, is that how you actually live your life? Because you don't worry about proving the way your car works. You put the key in, you turn it, and you drive it somewhere. You don't need to know all the other factors that go into it. There's massive complexity of engineering and chemistry and all things that go into that. That's not necessary for a functionally useful car. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and just outline kind of a development of thought. And this is your college course on philosophy. We're going to go quickly through. That's why I typed all this up so you can reflect on it later. Tried to give very quick examples in each case. But one of the earliest in the Greek philosophers was agnosticism. And it's not modern day agnosticism and there's no God, or I don't know if there's a God. It was, how do we even know truth exists? How do we determine truth? And I think it's this idea that nothing can be known or it's about its existence or nature beyond just the material observation. And even that will have some problems as we'll look at later developments of thought. But it's effectively, if my five senses can't discern it, then it can't exist or it can't be known. It's also this idea that because the knowledge is based on our senses, and you cannot always trust your senses. How many of you have ever seen an optical illusion? Your eyes play tricks on you, because of the way the drawing occurs. It's not that there's not an actual physical drawing, it's that your perception of that has been skewed based on the way that the eyeball perceives it. And their conclusion, therefore, was God was unknowable. Obviously, this got, substantial criticism later, but there were some significant thinkers, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, A.J. Ayres, all had versions of this. And I think the problem is that agnosticism is self-defeating, in that its assertion is that one knows enough about reality to affirm it, but that nothing can be known about reality. And so either one or the other is true. They can't both be. And just as by way of comparison, as we start rolling through these pretty quickly, agnosticism's very quick summary is we can know nothing about God, he's unknowable. Dogmatism, on the other hand, or even fideism in one form, we can know everything exhaustively about God. Everything there is to know about God, we can know. And finally, realism, we can know something about God because he's partially knowable. And I think you hopefully start getting this bracketing of ideas and understand there's probably some errors at these extremes, and somewhere in between lies the truth. I don't think, as in most Protestant thinkers today, we would say that God is fully knowable in all his attributes. He's infinite. But there are clearly elements of God we do come to know. We come to find his faithfulness. We come to discover his love. We come to see the fruit of the Spirit manifest as we obey him. We see the joy of being on purpose that's working towards something bigger than ourselves. Rationalism, this is the idea that all thoughts, opinions have to be based on reason and knowledge rather than religious belief or an emotional response. These were the guys who basically argued for math. It's holding that reality itself is this inherently logical structure, and there's a class of truths that you can intellectually grasp on their own. The idea like all triangles have three sides. There's a logical consistency by definition. I don't need to draw it out. I don't need to go experience it in nature. I can simply grasp it. And they would say everything has a reason or a cause. Now, it's interesting because this stands almost in direct opposition, by the way, to evolution, which says, no, there is no cause. It's all random. And so it creates some interesting issues. But key thinkers, Plato, Descartes, Leibniz. And I think the problem is just because something's possible doesn't mean it actually exists. And there's a fancy Latin term called a priori. If you're reading around this, you'll see it. What it basically is a philosophical starting point or a logical basis you can extrapolate from, something that exists outside your experience. And we'll come to this when we get into kind of the idea of intelligent design, but I think mathematics is an abstract concept that mirrors reality or reality conforms to, is a great example of the ultimate rationalism. 2 + 2 always equals 4. It doesn't matter what you feel. It doesn't matter how many times you say it's 5. It doesn't matter if you have consensus that says it's 6. None of that matters. There's an abstract absolute. Fideism is the doctrine that knowledge depends on faith or revelation does not need reason. And there were a number of Christian thinkers through time that have said this, that our experience in the religious or spiritual realm is sufficient. And there's an appealing element to that, no doubt. Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, said, I believe because it's absurd, that it's so removed from my experience, it must be true. Pascal, great mathematician and thinker, the heart is the absolute bedrock of all knowledge. It is the heart that experiences God and not reason. And I think to a degree, we'd agree as evangelical Christians that our experience of loving God is what makes it real. The question is that sufficient in an apologetic discussion or discourse? Is that enough proof for someone who's never experienced God? And again, even Martin Luther was in this camp. I think the problem is you either make a claim of truth or a truth claim or you don't, and without truth there can be no proof. Either God is absolutely who we describe him to be or he's not. And I can experience that for myself, and I think it's a supporting evidence, no doubt. I just don't think it's in and of itself sufficient. I love Kierkegaard's quote on this: objective truth is something we grip, but religious truth is something that grips us. It requires a leap of faith. And he's right. At the end of the day, I can give you a reasonable balance that the evidence for God is at least as good as any debate against him, and then you're still left to choose. And I think this is something that sometimes gets missed in even some of the modern debates in philosophy and theology. Am I okay? There's a balanced scale. That the evidence weighs out nicely, and that now you have to go and choose, am I going to experience it for myself? I can tell you that walking 20 minutes a day is good for you, but if you don't go actually experience it and do it, it's useless, even if it is in fact true. Experientialism, and this is something that we're seeing a lot of resurgence in secular humanism particularly, and it's the theory that it maintains that personal experience is the only or principal basis of knowledge, that all religious experience involves an awareness of the, quote, holy or something in the spiritual world. There's a number of key thinkers. Probably Rudolf Otto was the one who spent the most time developing this. Experiences, however, are capable of different interpretations. If I'm praying, hey, God, I need you to take care of this problem, a conflict, or I need an extra $100 to pay rent this week, or whatever it might be, and then some event occurs that answers that problem, what do I conclude about that? Is it reasonable to say there was a cause and effect, my prayer created outcome? Or is it just sheerly random that I extrapolated that into being God? And I think the great example of this is going to the zoo to learn about animals versus just reading about them. Firsthand you're observing, you're watching them, you're seeing how they interact. Quite frankly, getting probably some insight that the sheer textbook won't give you. And so I think there's some ideas, hopefully you'll start to conclude you probably need some combination of these ideas to really present a compelling and complete case. I think all of them have elements that are positive. I think many of them also have some weaknesses you need to be aware of. Evidentialism is the theory that justification of a belief depends solely on the evidence for it. Just the facts, ma'am. I'm the detective, I'm just taking notes. What happened? And I would say that the history of Christianity is unique and has validated elements. And we talked about this last week in the case for Easter. Where else have we seen a minority group with no power, influence, or position overtake all of the existing religious and political structures and even survive overt persecution for 300 years, being locked up in jail and lit on fire and fed to animals and all kinds of other unpleasant things? And I love this idea that history itself is a whole succession of events in time, which the spontaneity of the human spirit interacts with the outward occurrences, that we are responding to these things of history, either in real time because it's our history, or we're reading about it in somebody else's case. And I think one of the challenges in modern evangelicalism is we've lost some of the contact with early church history, and we've misunderstood, who some of those critical thinkers were, what their writings were, why they expanded theology really heavily in the first and second centuries. And there's a number of good thinkers here: Charles Dodd, William Paley, Robert Tennant. And the problem, however, is that facts and events have an ultimate meaning only within and by the virtue of the context of the worldview in which they're conceived, i.e., Jesus can only be the Son of God if there is a God or God exists. Prayer only works if we accept there's a spiritual tenet. These are the things that are important when you think about evidentialism, because some of modern science has tried to present themselves as this thought. That we're just looking at the science, just the facts. But the problem is we have lots of theories, including the theory of evolution, that we can't reasonably prove or even replicate. So by definition, it can't be science yet. It's a belief. And a great example of this is if I find fingerprints on a car out in front of a murder scene, the reasonable extrapolation is that those fingerprints belong to the killer. Now, it's possible that that car was parked in a mall earlier and the killer, or the accused person at least, touched the car in the mall and then it drove in front of the crime scene. But how far do we extrapolate facts to fit whatever our belief or presupposition is? And I think this is the challenge in very contemporary theoretical sciences is, God doesn't exist, therefore, crazy random things explain this. That's how this gets twisted very rapidly. I saw it very much when we talk about week 3 and the dating of certain papyrus records. I don't believe the gospel was written that early, therefore the dating can't be this early. It has to be 2nd and 3rd century because I don't think this gospel was written until later. It can't possibly be 70 or 50 or some of these cases very early ADs because it doesn't fit my narrative. And I've seen actually a couple of textual critics even say we won't accept it because it doesn't fit our presumption of when it was dated. Pragmatism, and I definitely fall in this camp at times, an approach that assesses truth of meaning of theories or beliefs in terms of their success's practical application. Does it work? And is it true that truth is what is experientially workable? If I hold a pen up and drop it, gravity will take it to the ground. Now, I could explain that space aliens have tractor beams in the sky and push the pen down, and I could create, an alternative hypothesis, but I know it's workable. Therefore, it's okay for me to accept its gravity, even if there is, in fact, some other explanation. If it works 100% of the time, good enough. In essence, the conclusion of it is if someone has sufficient experience and reason enough with it, they'll be led to one true conclusion. That's the underlying assumption. If you look at all these facts, here's really what you need to conclude based upon the outcome. And significant thinkers, Thomas Aquinas, Francis Schaeffer, there were real thinkers that held this view and argued from it, and I think somewhat effectively, Christianity works. And I have said before in discussions, I think Christianity is the greatest science ever. It is 100% consistent. It always works. Now, I may misinterpret God's will, God's timing, God's direction. There are things I may misunderstand. But in terms of, does God fulfill the promises he gives us? Yes. Does God ultimately love people? Yes. There are categorical things. If I forgive others, I receive a benefit versus I forget which, I think it was Aristotle said, unforgiveness is like having a cup of arsenic in between you and the person you hate, and you drinking it and waiting for them to die. So, unfortunately, there may be things that feel good or seem right that don't actually work. And ultimately, the final one is postmodernism. And I think this is pretty descriptive of the world we find ourselves in. It's an intellectual stance or mode of discourse characterized by skepticism toward any grand narratives of modernism, a rejection of any certainty of knowledge in essence, or stability of meaning, and a sensitivity to the role of ideology in maintaining political power. It basically says if the rich and powerful hold it, it must be bad. If I can't interpret it in terms of context in society, then it doesn't have any value. Many have probably heard something like, well, those are just old books written 2,000 years ago. They don't possibly have any bearing on today. We don't know how to interpret them. We don't know what to do with them. And in essence, reality is constructed through discourse, or other words, through an immersion of the influence of language, text, culture of the time. In other words, Instagram and Twitter and Facebook get to define truth. That what almost the consensus view is sadly what this distills down to. Let's all vote what's true. Well, okay, but that doesn't have any bearing whatsoever on what's true. And there's a number of key thinkers, Bernard Bell and I think Frederick Jemison were probably two of the big ones. The problem is without absolutes in some areas, there's no way to determine truth. It adds nothing to analytical or empirical knowledge. And this is a harsh criticism. There are a lot in academia that would flinch at this notion, but I think it's the logically consistent reality. If nothing can be determined to be categorically true for all time, then how do we know anything? Because what's popular today will be unpopular tomorrow. Certainly some of us have wardrobes from decades past that probably wouldn't meet today's standards, and people might look at us strangely if we broke out those attire. So maybe there are some things that are societally influenced. But on the other hand, well, in some cases, bell-bottom jeans are back. And so I use this as an example that memes are a modern cultural reference created to mock our reality. So here's a good example of one. Me, after watching 10 minutes of something on Netflix that took me an hour to choose. Now, 20 years ago, this would have no bearing whatsoever. Nobody knew who Baby Yoda was. Nobody knew who Netflix was. Today, everybody goes, okay, I get that. I understand the context of the phrase and the vocabulary. But is gravity determined by social construct? Is math determined by social construct? Is astronomy? Is biology? Are these things that are not absolutes throughout time and culture? That independent of your philosophical belief, they still are true. But I think we get caught in, and it's very interesting, where memes now literally get presented as modern philosophy, as modern deep thought. And if you make them move and use JPEGs and other things, it's even cooler. But it's so fleeting, and it's this dangerous thing. It's insidious in some ways to real thought. Because sure, it can be humorous. It can certainly, like all comedy, it can highlight a truth. I mean, these are facts. But to confuse something that's meant as entertainment with deep philosophical conclusion is dangerous. So I want to start off by giving you 10 points from my argument for Christianity. If somebody was sitting down with me, I wrote these down so you don't have to scribble notes furiously. I'll give you a little bit of flavor for them as we go, and then over the next 4 weeks I'll flesh these out in pretty good detail. For point one, I think the resurrection is still the leading rational support for Christianity. Paul said it, it's good enough for me. I think it is the central question of Christianity. If Christ was bodily resurrected from the dead, you got to do something with it. That's not the ordinary day at 7-Eleven. You're going to have to conclude something. If you want more detail, you can go back to last week's deep dive. We go through a very detailed case for it. There's plenty of supporting material out there, from Case for Easter through to Evidence Demands a Verdict. Lots of cases out there that builds the kind of infrastructure around that statement. Number two, I think Christianity is good psychology. I remember in psychology today, about, 15, 20 years ago now, this grand discovery of science, that it turns out that forgiveness was good for the human condition. I'm like, that sounds a lot like something I might have read a couple thousand years ago. I think I've heard that source before. But love, humility, acts of service, the things that the Gospels call us to be about validate good psychology. If you want good mental health as a general rule, doing these things builds toward it. Doing the opposite of them, anger, hate, selfishness, don't tend to build great mental health. And I think I can validate this by modern psychological study, by research, by papers, by all the economics of the brain, the Nobel Prize from 8 or 9 years ago, all affirm that Christianity is good science. Yes?
Back that up a little bit. My sister, who was not a Christian at the time, and I got in a discussion with her, I said, I thought you were a Christian. I said, you send your kids to Christian schools. She goes, oh, Steve, you don't believe all that. Christian schools raise good citizens. That's why we send them. I thought, and that goes along with the teachers of forgiveness.
Yeah.
But you don't believe all that.
Well, and so can other secular institutions, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. We can create people of character. No doubt we can support that. But, I think the interesting thing is when it gets to self-interest, what in society has the greatest magnetic attraction or pull or command towards putting your own interests aside for the interests of someone else? Secular humanism does not have an answer for this. They love to contrive it as the benefit of society or goodwill. Well, that's fine and dandy. Show me in history where that's proven to be true. For me, it goes back to Finding Nemo, the genius of the seagulls. Mine, mine, mine. Every little kid, it's like the third word they learn is mine. I don't have to sit them down and go, okay, now you need to be selfish, you need to say mine. It's instinctive. Its first reaction is really base. Anyone who wants to debate with me, the human condition isn't this way, will get badly disabused. Because I think I can very quickly demonstrate that Christianity is calling us to do something that is not our natural instinct with consistency. We would say that we are fundamentally flawed, wicked, sinful human beings, and we need redemption, saving, transformation of the mind, life change. Even at a secular level, okay, if we're going to argue for societal good even, are selfish, angry, unforgiving people going to build your utopian society? Or do you need some vastly different construct than we normally experience in our daily lives? Number 3, I think biology is too complex to explain with random chance, and we'll spend a fair amount of time of this over the next 2 weeks. I will give you just one fancy term called biogenesis. It's the idea of the primary ooze and the chemical compounds becoming life. That alone, no one has gotten to any reasonable discussion yet. They call it lucid is the abbreviation for it. But they have a fundamental scientific problem. No chemist says chemistry and chemical reactions evolve. They say it's absolute. If you do these experiments, it always results in this chemical byproduct. Biology, they've somehow been able to say, well, there's adaptation, therefore there's mutation, therefore we can kind of back into evolution. Okay, fine, if I grant that. No life, life. What happened chemically in the evolutionary cycle that allowed non-life to become life? Because you still can't do it in a lab. We still have no evidence that even is theoretically possible, and all chemists reject it at its face value. You have an insurmountable problem. Oh, by the way, the other minor detail is, okay, I grant you Big Bang, big explosion, cosmic dust, planets start forming, some kind of sustainable living environment happens on a planet in the speck of the universe. Now you need a second event that creates non-life to life. It's not explained by the first event. I can create a sphere of mass theoretically from an explosion, but even that's statistically unlikely, but it's at least physically possible. What I can't do is primarily ooze to single-cell organism. 4, I think there's observable good and evil, which speaks to universal morality. Now, I've seen some very creative debates around this, either denying there's any absolute morality, which is a default position for atheists, or, well, morality is socially constructed. Okay, well, what happens when the socially constructed environment is Nazi Germany? Because their choice morally, I think, all universally would condemn and say killing and slaughtering millions of people is totally unacceptable. Based on what, though? If it's morally, socially constructed, then it was fine, I guess, for that season of time, because that's what the majority supported, or at least the leadership supported. And like the idea of it being good psychology, if you really want to debate with me whether good and evil exists, be prepared for a beating intellectually, because I don't think we'll have to go much beyond last night's evening news for examples of evil. 5, I believe all human life has intrinsic value, not just societally assigned one. And this is unpopular in our current culture. I think we will stand and give account for the sin of abortion in this country. But I also look at the trend that's now emerging that's actually frightening, looking genetically in the womb for birth defects, other limitations, and making decisions about continuing that pregnancy or not, solely based upon whether they're going to be effective or contributing members of society. That is a horrifying thought and its implications.
They do that in Iceland already and have been doing it for years. They don't have autism.
Well, take one like Downs. I have friends that are parents that love their children with Downs, and if you've interacted with them, you understand they have this love of life and the simplicity of their understanding that's contagious. How do we say that life doesn't have intrinsic value? It's horrifying to me that we hold life that cheap. But I think if you don't grant me an eternal or a divine, and we're just a composition of random cells working for betterment of society, then that's a very logical outcome to that philosophy. Take out the underproducers, the non-contributors, the takers of society. It has horrible ramifications for aging and all kinds of other problems. I mean, it is catastrophic in its consequence if you actually sit with it for even 30 seconds and allow it to flesh out. And it's very interesting watching, for me, atheists trying to argue, no, really, we just didn't understand their contributions. You know, they're desperately trying to argue it's not really as bad as it seems. Number 6, I think there is a spiritual world that is knowable, and most people have had some experience with it. There is a sense of eternal, I think, in all people. I've had a lot of discussions through the years, and I've asked people, okay, putting aside Christianity, do you think there's anything in you that lives on beyond the biochemistry of your body? When you're dead, is there anything after that? Is there anything spiritual about you that's not explained by chemical reaction? The mind, the soul, whatever you want to call it. I've had exactly 1 in 40 years that said, nope, I'm just biochemistry. I am dust and I'll return to dust. There's nothing else besides that. Everyone else to some level has said, yeah, but I can't know it, or, it's too scary, or I don't know what to do with it, or I haven't had time to investigate, or whatever they quickly defend to. But if there is something that is eternal, what else can be possibly more important to tack down philosophically than what does that mean? Whether it's reincarnation or salvation or whatever other, particular philosophy you want to put around it, it has to matter. Your choice of coffee tomorrow morning can't possibly be as important as something that's spiritually eternal. Number 7, I've seen significant positive change in people and purpose in people pursuing Christianity. Some of you saw some of the baptisms, over Easter. That's a little microcosm of, or I guarantee if you spend a little bit of time reading, there are absolutely amazing stories of people that were very clearly on one path that ended up on another path, and it was radically different. Bent on, quite frankly, self-destruction or the destruction of those around them versus becoming other-centered, lifting others up, encouraging, forgiving, healing. I mean, these are things I can demonstrate in very clear terms, very first-hand stories. If somebody wants to say, no, Christianity can't possibly have any change, let me introduce you to about 6 or 7 people, and I think you'll be convinced pretty quickly that's an erroneous assumption. Number 8, God has given me specific, or has given me specific knowledge or unique knowledge about specific people or circumstances I could not have otherwise known. I've had it. I went up to a coworker, said, I don't know why God's told me I need to pray for you. Broke down in tears saying I was just diagnosed with cancer, no, my husband knows. Is that random chance? I guess. I don't typically have that experience. Hey, I just lost my job. I just lost a loved one. I'm dealing with some pain in the past. I've had numerous responses to that prompting, and there's a lot of times I'm going, God, I don't know if I want to say it, I might look foolish. But when I've done it, it's surprising how often I've gotten a response back that I could not have possibly known the circumstance. Yet, I think God very clearly prompted me to interact with that person and to be a voice of love and hope and truth in maybe a time of despair. Number 9, there are millions of recorded near-death experiences. Several clinical studies by mainline medical institutions that have shown the majority have life-changing outcomes, and about 20% have known things they otherwise could not have. A serial number or a tape on top of a monitor. Or, I loved the one I read the other day, somebody was clinically dead for several minutes. He was talking with a loved one in the other room. During lunch, he'd spilled spaghetti on his tie, but he had his surgical gear over when he was in operating. Lost the patient. Patient ended up coming back to life. Said, hey, I saw you talking to my sister, and you had a spaghetti stain. That's a pretty far out there one. You either were really good at lucky random guesses, or you had some knowledge that can't be explained by the fact your body was dead in the other room. In fact, I can tell you there's about 5 or 6 medical doctors that have written books about this, of coming to faith because of observing these near-death experiences and what people have said. Now, the kind of dovetail to that is in Africa and the Middle East, particularly today, there's a very high percentage of conversions that have come because they see the man of light or the man in white. There's actually billboards in Muslim countries that say, have you seen the man? And a QR code or web address to somewhere outside the Muslim world with the gospel message. I have several missionaries I've met that have encountered people that already were predisposed to believe Christ because they had encountered some version of what they believed to be him in spite of their cultural upbringing, and in many cases understanding that that would mean their family, their jobs, maybe even their lives to make that choice. And I would say number 10, I have personally experienced God in tangible ways and seen him provide in completely unexpected ways. You know, somebody that I hadn't talked to in years shows up to help with something. A check shows up in the mail Monday after I wrote a check tithing on Sunday that was a little uncomfortable for the exact amount I just tithed. And I saw the postmark was days earlier. Random chance? How far do you want to stretch it? You know, I've felt the presence of God. I understand the difference between being a young man who is angry and self-destructive and being one that occasionally gets it right and follows God poorly. But a poor fellowship is better than no fellowship. Any questions on my top 10?
Awesome.
Yeah. And I'd say you build your own. I mean, they've got to be ones you're comfortable talking about. They've got to be ones that feel real to you. You know, it can't be an artificial construct. And I think, quite frankly, for most of you, having 2 or 3 is more than sufficient in most conversations. But I do think you need to be thoughtful around, if I was asked to give a ready defense for the gospel, what would it look like? You know, I encounter that atheist, skeptic, humanist, whatever. I don't believe in God. It's all made up. It's all fairy tales. How can you possibly believe such drivel? You need to be able to articulate, here's why. And oh, by the way, what have you got to lose trying it? Occam's razor. If these things are reasonably believable, which is the better to believe? Which is the most favorable to believe? And if you can't experience God personally, come back and yell at me. I'm a big kid. I can handle it. But 99 out of 100 times when I've given that challenge, they're scared to do it. Because I'm not challenging them to go discover the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus or other things that are clearly fairy tales and legend. I'm asking them to meet the risen Christ. I'm asking them to meet the holy, personal God who loves them. And, you know, guys like Pascal have talked about, you know, the starry skies above and the moral law within amaze them, the whole in the soul that all men intrinsically know. There is something missing in the pursuit of things. And we've talked about this in this group before. The highest categories of profession for suicides is athletes, actors, and rock stars. They get athletes, actors, and rock stars. That's the 3 top suicide professions. They get what the world says is important. Money, power, fame, adulation. It's great. It's wonderful. And it's not enough. Yep. It's never enough. Yeah. Oh, you want one?
Well, don't you think the reason most people want to resist Christianity is because if you acknowledge it, then you have to become responsible?
Absolutely.
You have to take responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Something else, and I still have to do it.
Well, for me as a young man, anger felt powerful. It felt like I was in control. As I later learned, the great illustration is, anger is like applying fire to wood. It consumes the object that's producing it. It was destructive, objectively. On the flip side, psychology, forgiveness. Okay, we've got this nice psychological principle. If you accept that to be true, it has consequences for you. You then find yourself saying, okay, am I going to trust the science and am I going to be forgiving or am I going to hold grudges? all of these truths cause us to have to do something with them if they mean anything. I mean, we could debate whether red gel or green gel is better. It probably has no meaning. But these deep truths, how I should live, why am I here, what is my purpose, how do I interact with the divine, those you can't just put away on the shelf once you discover them. And so, yes, of course, there's a human resistance. You know, you've heard, I understand my own wiring. I'm fundamentally selfish at my core apart from God. I resonate to that statement. I'm not much, but I'm all I think about. There is a God. I am not it. I have encountered God in a way that is awe-striking, that has blown my mind, and I have no confusion if my little sphere of influence is this little speck in the eternal. It just isn't the case. I can put all the plastic trophies and ribbons and whatever else I want to put up, pieces of paper, and it doesn't matter. You know, you've heard me talk about it. I have fun with some of my academic colleagues, you know, that a PhD is just push your dummy. That's the acronym. You know, okay, you managed to put together some nice sounding positions and a doctoral thesis. You checked the time of class. Did it change your life? Did it change anybody else's life? Sadly, I have a great aunt whose doctoral thesis from Berkeley was the hallucinogenic effects of licking toads. Licking toads. And she experimented a lot, let me tell you. I will tell you with 100% certainty, that is not a good choice of life pursuit. Her mental faculties are severely impaired at the ripe age of 80 or some odd, and have been for probably 30 years, not very coherent. And her pen name was Queen Moo, in case you ever see a blog posted by her. And her life partner is R.U.Sirius, so, you know, there's that. All of that doesn't amount to a pile of beans in improving our culture and society. I'm thrilled that she was able to somehow persuade some doctoral advisor that this was a worthy thesis and all, but I'm sorry, I don't think that's going to be the great change of our society. I'm not sure it'll even catch on as a trend. I'm not sure most people go, yeah, licking toads sounds great. Let me try that of all my possible solutions. So, you know, there is this difference between knowledge and wisdom. There is a difference between even something that is a fact and something that matters. But we get very enamored by the shiny illusion, because it keeps us from the truth. It forces us to address ourselves. You know, it's not comfortable looking in the Christian mirror every morning and going, ugh, that's not quite right yet. I got some work to do. But I will tell you, my greatest joys of life have come when I've gotten after that thing that wasn't right, and I worked at it, and some of those were decade-long, you know, buffing, polishing, sanding the character or the flaw till it wasn't there anymore. And then I actually can look back and go, I did something that was worthwhile. I actually now can help more people than I could have in that flawed state. And by the grace of God, He hasn't given it to me all at once. 40 years ago, Easter, I came to faith. Thank God that first day He didn't give me the entire list and go, okay, we're going to work on these things for the next 40 years. I would have run the other way. He gave me about one or two, and then each time there was the next one or two. And by the grace of God, some things I don't deal with anymore, some things I'd still struggle through. But I have absolute certainty that I've been transformed and changed because I've pursued the spiritual universe in a flawed way, but an honest way, trying to get it right. No, Bob?
Yeah, so atheism is actually a religion, and it's really kind of fun when you talk about atheism and convince them that their beliefs are actually a religion. And so when they try to do the separation of church and state, they're actually trying to supplant their church over God and trust.
Well, and Dr. Turk, who was an atheist, wrote a book, and I love the title. It's I Don't Have Enough Faith Anymore to Be an Atheist. You know, as he started exploring science, he realized it didn't hold up. And he was having to believe things that were, quite frankly, far-fetched by any reasonable definition of science. Now, agnostic is just, I don't know. Quite frankly, it becomes the lazy answer. Well, you still eventually are going to have to pick. It can't be both. There's pseudo-God. It's either there is God or there's no God. And if there is a God, there's substantive consequences to that. And if there is no God, quite frankly, the French existentialists had it right. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. You're a speck on a ball hurtling through space. There is no purpose. There is no meaning. There is no value. It's only what you construct for yourself, so go have fun. Hedonism is the natural, logical conclusion to atheism, in my opinion. So I want to switch gears slightly and talk about now things that modern skeptics say. And I hope we'll address these over the next couple of weeks. But I want you to be prepared. I don't want any of these to surprise you. I think you need to at least consider or contemplate these topics and have a sense. Number one, the Bible is not historically accurate. It has been changed. This is a significant conversation. Guys like Bart Ehrlman, one of the leading atheist critics of the New Testament, talks about there are 400,000 errors in the New Testament. When you get down to, okay, how many of those were anything that was substantial that any reader could reasonably look past? A spelling error, change of grammar, those things, about 1%. The other thing he fails to say is there's about 5,300 manuscripts of the New Testament in the first 3 centuries. We have far more copies of the Bible than any other ancient literature. So by definition, if I have 5,000 copies, one of those says one thing, the other 5,000 or 4,099 say another. I guess there's 4,099 errors. Most of you, if you read something modern translation like an ESV, which obviously is the preferred translation here, will put brackets around anything that's ever had any substantive critique. The longest single passage is the case of the woman caught in adultery. You without sin cast the first stone. If you just black out all those sections, and then they went to Jerusalem. Okay, nice historical thing, but if they're now in Jerusalem, I didn't need you to tell me they went there. If you blacked out every one of those, there's nothing that has any material impact on the doctrine or the gospel accounts. They are phrases in the most case. And when we get to that in 3 weeks, I'll show you the papyrus records. I'll show you where the critiques have come. I'll show you very detailed analytics around why those statements have been made. Dan Brown, the Da Vinci Code, popularized this, that somehow the Bible just got scribbled down by some random group of guys in the 4th century, and there was no prior record, which is ludicrous. Science proves Christianity false. Okay. Science proves evolution false, for sure. I'm not sure it proves Christianity false, because if you grant me an all-powerful creator, I think pretty much everything from there is easy. If you don't grant me an all-powerful creator, well, now we have all kinds of problems. You cannot trust your own perceptions because they're biased with presuppositions or presumptions. Yes, of course we all have biases. Yes, it's true. The majority of the near-death experiences seem to encounter light versus the alternative. And I don't think biblically it's probably the reality. Now, lots of scholars have pointed out, how much of that's the halo effect, if it's short, how much of it is, we obviously see there is judgment, both for the believer and the non-believer, bema seat of Christ, judgment seat of the Father. You might experience light for a while, doesn't mean that's where you're staying. And if you read any of the accounts of encountering hell, and some of those, it's chilling. One of my favorite, this kind of the more innocuous version, is just hell is this place of all these naked people sitting as far as you can see, moving farther and farther away from each other. That's hell. No human interaction, no love, just hopelessness. And obviously then there's Lake of Fire. There's all kinds of other fun ones you can read too. Another one which somewhat cracks me up is the statement, there is no absolute truth. Well, if that statement is true, then there's at least one truth, and there is no absolute truth. It's self-contradictory. Sorry, you try playing again. But it is the underlying idea. Well, truth isn't knowable, so why should I start? Well, come on. So you've never done anything for your occupation, for your family, for your personal enjoyment, for your hobbies. You've never learned anything because you can't know everything or can't know with certainty everything? That's ludicrous. Of course you have. You've pursued things that you knew you would have limited or finite knowledge of and been perfectly content. There is no universally true morality or ought. It's just an evolutionary reaction or decision based upon what creates the greatest happiness. It's the enlightened self-interest. And as I articulated, I think clearly earlier, I just don't buy it. History doesn't support this at all. The powerful take what belongs to other people with consistency. I can point to you kings, monarchs, rulers throughout history that lived very fine lives relative to the social context they were in, and had a whole lot of peasants and servants and slaves and everybody else that didn't live that life. These were not benevolent dictators. That is the human condition. Welcome to humanity. That is just your truth, and I can have my own. This is a very popular one. We've gotten to it, obviously, about gender, morality, spirituality to a degree. Okay. But if you go to the top of the building and flap really hard and say, I don't believe gravity applies to me, and you jump, I'm sorry, you're going to encounter the fact that gravity doesn't care about your opinion. If you run your car out of gas, you may believe that it doesn't matter if it's on E, but eventually you'll find out it in fact does matter because your car will stop running. It's, to me, ludicrous at the extreme to say, in essence, I just have to feel really strongly about something. And then you have the problem of, okay, but what about things like love, aesthetics, beauty? Yeah, of course, there's some levels of eye of beholder, but why does it even exist? You can't explain it in evolutionary terms. There's no value to aesthetic. Why do we respond? There's no evidence for God. I think we've already started creating some of those arguments. I think there is compelling rationale that there is a God. Go spend a prolonged period of time of nature and tell me that it really was, in all of its complexities and beauty and colors and cycles of life, sheerly random, unforeseen, unpredictable forces. The problem of evil and suffering, and Colin started talking about this. I mean, it's great that we talk about, absolutely God can handle your suffering, your pain, no doubt. I think we also need some explanations, and we'll cover that a little bit more next week. But my shortest answer is, sometimes suffering is necessary for improvement. Most of you have heard the phrase, no pain, no gain. If you're going to go physically get in better shape, you will have to encounter some levels of suffering. That's not a disputed physiological fact. It is necessary. And if I start from a thesis that God wants the most number of people possible to come into loving relationship with him, I hate to say it, but C.S. Lewis was right. Pain is God's megaphone. For God to get my attention, and many people I've talked to, it required an exceptional level of pain, to the point you said, okay, fine, I give up. I surrender. I'm broken. I can't do it my way anymore. Whatever that was, I'm done. That's the reality. I wish it wasn't. I wish I was smart enough to learn from other people's mistakes. I don't tend to find myself there. I have to go touch the stove, make sure it's still hot. But, even that in the simple pain sensor is imperative that I experience pain. It's horrible for those with diabetes or other nerve deadening or numbing agents that don't experience pain because they end up with all kinds of horrible consequences they weren't even aware of, the damage happening to a foot or a limb or whatever. You cannot know anything about the spiritual universe with certainty, and I think this goes to the earlier one. That's okay. I do most of my life without absolute certainty. I have probability. If I get in my car and drive home, the high probability is I'll arrive there safe. Yes, about 1 in 100 people will experience some fairly significant car accident in their life. That's just the statistics. I just go, I'll accept that because I'd rather be able to drive than any other mode of transportation between here and my house. Everything that happens has a naturalistic explanation. Lots of things do have naturalistic explanations. But if I really probe in, very few people have told me they've never encountered something that they had no question why it happened or how it happened that way. Whether it was a physical harm that they avoid the natural consequence of. I've talked to several people who've flipped or rolled or otherwise, ended up in bad positions, vehicles, and walked away with barely a scratch. That's not typically what happens in those cases. I've known several people who overdosed, and the amount of chemical in their body should have killed them, and it didn't. I've known several that have been shot and stabbed, other things that the medical science says they should have died, and they didn't. Is there a naturalistic explanation to that? It doesn't seem to meet the normal expected outcome given the facts. And finally, religion is just a man-made, culturally shaped thing. And I would say, true, religion is man-made. Spirituality, relationship with God, is not man-made. That is God-made. Religion has abused God's calling more than once. I grant that thesis. I also would say that the church has probably done more good for humanity than any other institution in the world. Not to try and say that you earn your way in goods and bads, but let's take it holistically. Modern banking, hospitals, education, most versions of trade and tariffs exist because of the church. Significant segments of our art, of history, philosophy, most of our modern science was derived by people who had a belief in some version of God. And I think to say that all that has stood the test of thousands of years of human history, we look at the full context of Judeo-Christian faith, was solely man-made. None of it was grounded in anything other than just man's stories. Seems just ludicrous and preposterous at the extreme. It would be to deny any sense of valid historical knowledge of the ancient period of time in its entirety. Now, if you're just prepared to throw it all away and say nothing existed till today, well, all right, I guess we can start there. But now, what about tomorrow? What will shape tomorrow? And is there anything non-biological, non-naturalistic that will shape tomorrow? And do you really want to live in a world to which there is no positive force? And I think it would be reasonable to say there seems to be at least some level of negative destructive force that's observable in our world. Is that really the world you want to be in? Is there any attractiveness to that position? Any other things you've heard skeptics say? None? Do we cover the list? Dave?
The problem with believers not, just not being good people, being negative, kind of covered already.
No, but there are a lot of people, and particularly if you look at the modern kind of YouTube secular humanist group, that were Christians at one time, at least by their testimony, got ground up by humans, got hurt, and decided that faith wasn't true anymore. Newsflash. I'm a broken, hurting person. Hurting people hurt other people. That's a sad reality. That is not consistent with the faith that I would hold, what I see in Scripture. My humanness is not what Scripture calls me to be. It calls me to be something different than that. And it calls me at a very simplistic level. Christ was said, okay, summarize it all. Love God, love your neighbor. You pretty much figure the rest out from there. I don't know a lot of objections that go, I met a group of Christians that was too loving. I've so far not heard that one. I'll be thrilled if I ever get that one. It's usually they were too judgmental, they were too rigid, they were too broken, whatever. There are lots of other descriptors. It's rarely they were too loving. In fact, never in my entire life have I heard that one. And I think that is a pressure point that should be convicting for each of us. Am I personally living in a way that's fragrant, that if someone sees my life, they conclude, you know what? Scripture is real, valid, and true. I can see it. And what I would say in my own personal observation, lots of people change for the worse. They de-evolve, if you will, as personalities and become more selfish. I'm dealing with in-laws right now. As dementia starts setting in, there's some very childlike behaviors that start emerging. It's very clear where the natural human pattern becomes. On the other hand, I know of really few cases of someone who I would say has really made substantive forward progress over time in their character and relationships apart from Christ. I think AA even starts from the idea if you can't wrestle through the higher power, you probably don't have a lot of ways to go from there. If it's just you and your own will, I think we've already proven if you're an addict, your will is not sufficient to overcome addiction. Sorry. And so I think I can provide a reasonable at least position that the behavior you may see from Christians probably doesn't mirror what the Bible says is the ideal. Secondly, even if I ascribe there are flawed people, the way people get better, less flawed, more whole, healed, is through the pursuit of Christ, not through the pursuit of humanistic values and interests. I don't think you reason your way to becoming more loving. Pat?
Yeah, I asked here, if there's a loving God, how can you allow what's being suffered?
Yeah, and that very much is the problem of evil. We'll tackle that next week. I think two big questions is the world as it's created the one that will lead the most people with free will to loving relationship with God? Or is there one with less suffering possible to do that? And two, in our own lives, has suffering always been negative, or has it been an instrument of change? And if it's an instrument of change, then suffering has purpose. It's not random. And I think you have to further separate it. We'll look at next week in more detail. Suffering caused by humans, which is purely free will, versus natural disaster. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, all those things. Yes?
It's our perception of our suffering.
Hmm?
Are we looking at it as God's way of smoothing off the rough edges? Are we looking at it as, why me? Poor me. How come I'm suffering? Why should I have to suffer? Is it a challenge to do better? Is it a way to put it down?
Well, as I'd seen years ago, the great quote, opportunity, everybody likes in concept, they just don't like it in practice because it shows up in overalls with work gloves on. You know, it usually involves some amount of work. Clearly there's perception, and I think if you wanted to ask me what I think a key indicator of long life is, it's being engaged in the lives of others in causes greater than yourself. I would say that is probably the single biggest determinant. And part of the benefit of that is I very rapidly understand that my problems are very trivial compared to what some people are dealing with on a daily basis. That's not to say I'm not entitled to feel the emotions that go with it, but it is to give perspective. But there are things that are objectively horrific. A rape and killing of a small child is horrific. I mean, there is no perception necessary there. Unfortunately, that is a human choice, and it usually comes out of a very broken place. And Proverbs is pretty clear on this. There is a way that seems right to man that leads to destruction, and I've lived it in my own life. When I've relied on my own understanding, it doesn't typically go real well. When I've relied on God, it's always gone well in the end. Now, sometimes there was difficulties and suffering along that journey. Sometimes I get mocked for it or whatever. I mean, it happens. But I don't want to sugarcoat. There is real evil and real pain and real suffering in this universe that isn't just caused by humans. And it is a fair conversation to have. And I also then flip it back around and say, okay, then what's the humanistic solution for that? If you don't like the divine solution, which is it's measured in eternity, and this world is fleeting, if this is all there is, and you are a child in Africa who is constantly on the threshold of starvation and probably will die at a very young age, what's the humanistic answer to that? Yeah.
Kind of our modern answer to that is drugs, alcohol, entertainment, distraction, anything that keeps you off the sun.
In first world, absolutely. Half the world's population lives on under $2.68 a day. It's subsistence living. 60% of the hospital beds of the world are filled with people from waterborne illnesses that were either fully preventable or treatable with less than $20. And I do think the church should be convicted about solving human suffering that's solvable. That is a fair critique by the secular world. But I also will tell you the majority of orphanages around the world are run by Christians. You know, the majority of the hospitals in third world countries that are run on fundamentally donations are generated by Christian organizations. That's the reality. Now, does that solve all the problems? No, it doesn't. I'll be the first to say it's true. But I also will point out that specifically the church in America is the leading benefactor of the world. It could do more. On average, churches donate about 2 to 3% as the average tithing level. if the church actually tithed at something approaching 10%, we would not have waterborne illness anywhere in the world anymore. It would be solved. We would have very little starvation. I mean, there are things that would be solved. And so, that is something we have to wrestle with, and what's God's calling to us. And I've had this discussion with a number of people. Could you give up a coffee every week or twice a week and get $5 a week? Because that'll save a life permanently. $20 a month, most of the world can be fed, clothed, and even educated. So, there are things that we need to do.
Okay, Brian?
Yeah.
I have a thought about atheists in particular. I have a friend that I've gone back and forth with a little bit. And at one point, he backpedaled, saying that, because I have a book, he can point to that book and cheer me up. But he doesn't have a book, which is absolutely, isn't true, of course, because there's lots of books about atheism. And it seems that the typical atheist they have not read their books, or they ascribe willy-nilly to this particular belief and this author. This went over here with this other author, but they really don't come to terms with the basic tenet, which is maybe number 3 up there, really laughable, is that they will acknowledge evolution and that we are a random collection of particles or cells, and out of which we can't trust our thoughts because they're random, because we're random. But that doesn't apply to them in particular with anything that they have to say.
Well, I think there's two prevailing camps, you will, of atheism. One is simply there is no God, and I reject it, and I'm entitled to my own agenda, basically. The other is predominantly defined as secular humanism, which I've seen more than one apologist debate and say, well, you're just taking Christianity light, because you're taking God out, but you still say there ought to be these moral values, there ought to be this, cultural interest, there ought to be this, beneficial collective, all these grand ideas without any concrete absolute underpinning. Just, well, we assert it should be this way.
A fundamental, the fundamentalism, atheist fundamentalism will just simply say that there is no such thing as morality. It doesn't. There's no difference because there isn't a good and evil.
What they typically
Most atheists are aware that that's a fundamental belief born out of a collection of random thoughts.
in modern academia, what I would say is I think most atheists would say there is no absolute morality, but they would very quickly try to assert there is some subjective or cultural morality or ought or desire because somehow it's well-being or maximum benefit, utility, if you will. Because they don't like the conclusion, if I really said there's no morality, we might as well just break down all society and might makes right, survival of the fittest, everybody good luck. It's the Hunger Games. I mean, we couldn't possibly function as a society in reality if you carried that logical conclusion out. So I don't think most of academia would say there's no morality. They've just said you can't judge mine, and mine's constructed on some other thesis than God or objective underlying morality or conscience or a variety of other things. And they create very often terms that are similar in definition. We've talked about this before, quantum universe and the quantum particles and the Higgs boson and then dark matter space at the telescopic level, and it's this substance or essence that holds all things together that accounts for all creation. Well, that sounds an awful lot like the definition we used to use for God. I mean, you've put a different title on it, but you still said that characteristic is there, and we're going to look at that in the ontological argument later. Just in the interest of time, I'll give you one quick argument so you have a flavor for some of these that are coming. The watchmaker intelligent design argument, sometimes called the teleological argument, and it's fundamentally the argument for the existence of God that contends that the order and patterns present in the universe are evidence for God's existence. If nature's complexities are designed, then something must have designed it. If systems work certain ways consistently, you assume it, and you don't even need your glasses to assess this is a lot of zeros. Tony Badilla is one of the kind of leading cosmologists, secular atheist. He estimates the number of particles in the universe is this number, 3 to the 10th to the 80th power, lots of zeros. And he has a lot of math that goes behind that, and it excludes leptons and quarks, but it includes all things we'd normally consider molecules. That's a big number. The number that's even bigger than that is the Penrose number, another atheistic mathematician that just won the Nobel Prize in 2020 for physics. He says the likelihood of the universe's entropy state, the right conditions for the Big Bang at the moment of the bang, is 10 to the 10th to the 123rd power, which is more zeros than all the particles in the universe. So if you started writing this out, and you put a zero on every single molecule in the known universe, you'd run out of particles by trillions times trillions times trillions. Now, I guess we go, that's science. It just happened, or it had to happen, therefore it is. I saw a recent argument called the puddle argument, because we say there's design and the universe is so finely tuned to support our life. And the counter in the current academia is, yeah, but a puddle wakes every morning and looks around their environment and goes, look, it's perfectly fit to me. Every shape is contoured in my body. Okay, well, fair, yes, the shape that water fills is exactly the hole in the ground. But where'd the ground come from? Where did the water come from, since it's really, really, really important to life and doesn't exist in at least most of anywhere we've explored in space so far? It's kind of a big deal. It's one of the massive problems for Mars. If we're ever going to make it habitable, we've got to find water. And that's just the closest planet to us, never mind something further out. When science starts talking about this, it's scientific. Well, I have to still deal with probability. Some older apologists used to say, well, it's like a tornado going through a junkyard and out comes a functional 747. That's way more likely than this number. I mean, it's way more likely than the most extreme scenario you could possibly create. And that's 1 second, right at the bang, perfect alignment. Okay, if your thesis is there is no God, then this must be the alternative. I understand that. But if this is flawed, then maybe the opposite is true. There must be a God. And it's very fun in the academic circles where you get guys who are very good scientists that aren't just hacks from an armchair view, but have mastery over this. Biologists, chemists that start debating down to the actual science. And it gets pretty embarrassing pretty fast for a large majority of the atheists who are used to very trite statements and not being challenged with the depth. And this is where I said early on, I want to raise the level of thinking in Christian circles, because I think, it is researchable, it is knowable to some levels. I don't think you have to master it all, but to get at least a flavor for why is it reasonable that I don't think evolution meets the scientific test. I don't think Big Bang meets the scientific test. In fact, most scientists have now said this was what propelled the multiverse theory. I now needed millions of universes to try and make this number a little smaller, because if I have millions of chances to get this number, somehow it gets easier. It still is astronomically beyond comprehension. And it then leads to such this idea of vanity and futileness of life. If this was just the random outcome of some long odds way beyond winning the lotto, why does that have any value? Why does life have value? Yes, Bob.
Continuum of that tornado picture that you just gave to us is, not only does it go through like the 747, but now the 747 is able to produce more 747s.
Sure. Yeah, self-replicate, because that's always what happens. Put Boeing out of business fast. We're going to do an abbreviated Q&A, because then we'll do our potluck afterwards. You can keep going on these. So maybe pick one question out of the four to discuss. We'll take maybe 5 or 6 minutes in small groups to do this. Number one, which basis of knowledge is most appealing to you? What kind of do you lean towards? What are a few arguments you would use in the defense of Christianity? What are a few objections you've heard from skeptics? You can share it in our open forum, maybe in your small group. And finally, what amazes you most about the complexity of nature? Is it, the way a hummingbird operates? Is it the color of tropical fish? Is it the starry sky? Is it the sunrise that's multicolored? Is it the, majesty of spring coming out and all that was brown and dead coming green and blossoming? What in nature amazes you? So take those, and then we'll come back and conclude and enjoy our potluck.